Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. The Lanterns of Blackmere Hollow. Chapter 1. The Red Lantern. The October air of Blackmere carried the faintest scent of wood smoke and wet leaves. Fog drifted lazily along the winding lanes, clinging to hedgerows and lampposts like pale ribbons of silk. Into this quiet mist rolled the evening coach from Downbridge, and from it descended a small, neatly dressed woman with silver hair tucked beneath a soft grey hat. Her gloved hand adjusted the strap of her carpet bag as she peered through the haze with mild curiosity. Miss Jane Marple had arrived in Blackmere, a village she had never visited, though she had heard of its charm from her old friend, Mrs. Margaret Whitby. The coachman tipped his cap, the horse exhaled a puff of steam, and within moments the coach vanished back into the fog, leaving Miss Marple standing at the edge of the green. The lamps glimmered like ghosts, and the faint notes of laughter echoed somewhere beyond the churchyard. "Ah, there you are, Jane!" Mrs. Whitby came bustling forward, wrapped in a tartan shawl, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You must be frozen! We've the fire going, and the kettle nearly singing. It's quite the night to arrive, my dear. You'll see the lanterns soon. The whole village is alight." Miss Marple smiled softly. "I do hope they're not wasting good candles for decoration." "Oh, heavens no," Margaret laughed. "It's tradition. The Lantern Festival. We light the road from the church to the hollow marsh. They say it guides the departed back to rest." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the mist. "Though some say the red ones guide them elsewhere." "Superstition," Miss Marple said gently, though her voice carried the faint amusement of one who had long learned that superstition often hides human design. "Lead the way, my dear." They walked arm in arm through the crooked lane that led to the green. All around them glowed pumpkin lanterns, carved faces flickering with gold light, hanging from hooks and posts. The smell of roasted chestnuts and damp earth filled the air. Villagers clustered by the tavern, children skipped with sparklers, and somewhere a fiddler played a brisk country tune. Yet beneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of watchfulness, as if every smiling face waited for something unseen. "Quite the spectacle," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes following the rows of lanterns lining the road toward the marsh. "So many lights, yet so much fog. How curious." Near the edge of the green, she met a few of the locals. Samuel Holt, the blacksmith, was supervising the hanging of lanterns on the hollow road. His hands, rough as bark, handled each candle with surprising delicacy. "Evening, Mrs. Whitby." "Evening to you, miss," he said, politely, tipping his cap. "Best keep back from the hollow tonight. Marsh gas, they say." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, noting the faint smear of red on his sleeve. Or perhaps just imagination. A few yards away, Evelyn March, the schoolteacher, arranged children's lanterns in perfect symmetry. Her precision caught Miss Marple's eye, as did the calm tension in her jaw, the kind seen in people who fear being watched. The teacher smiled, too briskly, and turned away. And then came the rhyme, half-chanted, half-whispered, by the villagers near the tavern. "When the lantern burns red, one soul must be led." Mrs. Whitby frowned. "Oh, I wish they wouldn't sing that. It gives me shivers." Miss Marple only smiled faintly, her gaze drifting down the road where the mist grew thicker, turning the lanterns into blurred stars. It began subtly. A hush fell over the crowd as one lantern, far down the hollow road, shifted in colour. At first, it glowed a warm orange, then deepened slowly into crimson. Someone gasped. The fiddler stopped mid-tune. "The lantern man walks tonight," whispered an old woman near the bakery door. Mrs. Whitby clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Do you see it? The red one?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "And if I were a candlemaker, I'd like to ask who mixed that wax." The villagers began murmuring prayers. Someone covered their lantern, others blew theirs out altogether. Within minutes, laughter had drained away, replaced by a frightened silence that even the fog seemed to respect. Miss Marple looked calmly from face to face. Fear, she noted, has a scent. Sharp and metallic, like cold iron, it makes people look in the wrong direction. As the crowd dispersed, she observed the hollow road again. One figure lingered by the last post, tall, broad-shouldered, coat collar raised. Then in a blink, the figure vanished into the mist. Blackmere awoke beneath a pale sun that struggled through the fog. Miss Marple had just finished her breakfast when a knock came at the Whitby door. A red-faced boy stood panting, cap in hand. "Please, ma'am, they found Mr. Pike by the hollow road. He's dead," Mrs. Whitby gasped. "Oh, merciful heavens! Thomas Pike, but he was here last night." "Yes, ma'am," said the boy. "They says the lantern man took him." By the time they reached the road, the inspector had arrived, Inspector Grayson, tall, crisp, and sceptical of anything he couldn't catalogue. The body lay near the 5th lantern post, one glove missing, coat stained with hardened wax. The red lantern still flickered nearby, its flame trembling in the breeze. "Old fool must have slipped and cracked his skull," Grayson muttered. "Probably drunk. And that nonsense about a red lantern. Village hysteria, that's all." Miss Marple didn't answer. She crouched lightly beside the body, her eyes tracing every detail. The wax on the coat was smooth, not mottled like the lantern wax. A faint trace of dye clung to the fabric, reddish-brown, not candle soot. She touched the ground, 2 sets of footprints, one deeper and broader, the other faint and small. And there, almost lost in the grass, a sliver of broken wood, curved as if from a lantern handle. "Inspector," she said softly, "forgive an old woman's curiosity, sir, but did you notice that the lantern beside him was the only one without smoke inside its glass?" Grayson frowned. "What of it?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple murmured. "Only that a flame so clean must have burned very recently." The inspector turned away, shaking his head. "You people and your ghost tales, leave this to the professionals, Miss Marple." She smiled politely. "Oh, I always do, until they ask for help." By late afternoon, the fog thickened once more, wrapping the hollow like a shroud. Villagers hurried home, bolts sliding into place, curtains drawn tight. Miss Marple stood at the window of Mrs. Whitby's parlour, tea in hand, watching that same crimson lantern sway faintly in the mist. "Strange business," murmured Margaret, setting down the tray. "They say he was cursed." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the flickering red light. "My dear, curses are merely tools for clever people, and someone in this village is using one rather neatly." As dusk fell, the lantern glowed brighter, and the fog seemed to pulse around it, red and alive. Miss Marple did not believe in omens, the narrator might have said, but she knew how swiftly fear can light a candle in the dark. Chapter 2. Whispers by Candlelight. By morning, Blackmere had lost its voice. The cheerful chatter of the festival had withered into murmurs that clung to the fog like dying embers. The shutters of shops remained half-closed, as if the village itself preferred not to see daylight. The blacksmith's forge stood silent, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Even the church bell seemed to hesitate before tolling, as though afraid of waking whatever had been stirred in the night. In Mrs. Whitby's house, the air smelled faintly of wax and tea. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, the newspaper folded neatly beside her. The report of Thomas Pike's accidental death took up barely 2 lines. Below it, an advertisement for coal, glowed more confidently. She stirred her tea once, twice, then set the spoon down with delicate finality. "I never believed the lantern man nonsense," said Mrs. Whitby, fussing with the sugar bowl. "But it's unsettled everyone. Lydia's lit candles in every corner, says it keeps the darkness out." "Quite natural," Miss Marple replied softly. "People light candles when they're afraid. It gives the illusion that darkness is something outside rather than within." From the hallway drifted the sound of the maid, Lydia, humming nervously as she replaced another stub of candle on the mantel. The young girl's hands shook slightly. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement. Steady, kind, but observant. The wax she handled was pale beeswax, not the paraffin blend she'd seen on the dead man's coat. By afternoon, Mrs. Whitby insisted they pay a visit to Agnes Rowley, the fisherman's widow who saw something near the churchyard that night. The walk was short, though the fog made it feel much longer. It muffled every sound and softened every shape, until even familiar cottages looked like strangers. Agnes lived in a narrow brick cottage with lace curtains yellowed by smoke. Inside, the hearth glowed with timid warmth, and the table was crowded with teacups and a plate of seed cake. 3 other women were already there, neighbours, their voices weaving in and out of one another like tangled threads. "It was him, sure as daylight," Agnes said, wide-eyed and triumphant. "I saw Mr. Pike walking down toward the hollow, I did, and someone following him. Couldn't see who, fog thick as soup. But the lantern man's red light, I saw that plain as sin." "Did you indeed?" said Miss Marple gently, settling her knitting in her lap. "And was it before or after Mr. Pike passed the old oak by the road?" "Oh, before, I think." Agnes frowned. "Or maybe after. It's hard to tell the way the mist dances about." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Mist does have a way of making memories waltz, Mrs. Rowley." The other women giggled nervously. One leaned forward, whispering, "They say the red light means the marsh wants a soul. Every 7 years." "Rubbish," muttered another. 7 years ago it was just the flood. People like to see patterns in puddles." Miss Marple listened, saying little. She noted how every version of the story changed slightly, how detail melted and reformed like candle wax. When Agnes insisted again that one lantern had refused to light, Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Refused to light?" she repeated softly. "Aye, near the smithy. Samuel Holt said the wick were damp. Threw it away, he did." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note, her fingers resuming their quiet rhythm. "How odd," she murmured, "for a man who works with fire to fear a little flame." Evening fell early. The fog pressed against windows like slow-moving smoke, and every house in Blackmere glowed with tiny flames, rows of candles flickering in defiance of the dark. In Mrs. Whitby's parlour, the curtains were drawn, and shadows from the fire danced across the wallpaper. "I don't like this," Mrs. Whitby whispered. "It feels as though something's listening." "Then speak softly," Miss Marple said mildly, winding a ball of wool. "But do keep speaking. Silence breeds imagination." A gust rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, a boy ran by, shouting, "The red lantern's lit again!" The cry faded into the fog. Lydia, passing through with the teapot, nearly dropped it. Miss Marple reached forward and, without a word, snuffed out one of the candles on the mantel. The flame vanished, the room dimmed, everyone froze. "There," she said. "Nothing dreadful happened, did it?" Her tone was gentle but firm, the voice of reason slipping into hysteria's shadow like sunlight through lace. "Fear, my dear Mrs. Whitby, is only power we lend to others. Best not to give it credit." Shortly after 8, a knock sounded at the door. It was Evelyn March, the schoolteacher, a tall woman with fair hair pinned neatly beneath her hat. She carried a basket of books, her tone polite, her eyes tired. "I came to bring those grammar primers you wanted, Mrs. Whitby," she said. "Forgive the hour. I didn't want to come through the hollow after dark." "You were wise not to," Mrs. Whitby said quickly. "We've had enough tragedy for 1 week." Evelyn smiled faintly and turned to leave, but Miss Marple's gentle voice stopped her. "My dear Miss March, your fingers, they seem to have caught a little colour. How interesting." The teacher glanced down, startled. A faint, reddish tint stained the edge of her right index finger. She rubbed it hurriedly with her handkerchief. "Oh, paint," she said. "The children's play. We're doing Macbeth next term." "How ambitious," Miss Marple replied, her tone as mild as milk. "And I do admire red on stage, though perhaps less so on candle wax." Evelyn's eyes flickered for the briefest second. Then she smiled too brightly. "Good night, Mrs. Whitby. Miss Marple?" After she'd gone, Miss Marple looked at the sideboard where Evelyn had set her basket of books for a moment. Beneath the remaining candle stub lay a faint ring of wax, not white, but pinkish red. She said nothing, merely poured herself more tea. Later that evening, Inspector Grayson arrived, his overcoat dusted with fog and his patience worn thin. He bowed stiffly. "Just routine," he said. "We've closed the Pike case. Accidental fall. The coroner will confirm." Mrs. Whitby let out a sigh of relief. "So no murderer, then?" "None," said Grayson firmly. "And no ghost either, I should think." Miss Marple looked up over her knitting. "How comforting, Inspector, though I confess I've rarely known wax to climb onto a man's coat of its own accord." Grayson frowned. "You mean the wax on Pike's body? Lantern drippings, surely?" "Not quite." Her voice remained calm. "Lantern wax cools mottled and uneven. This was smooth. Paraffin blend, perhaps melted in a tin, used by candle makers, not children. You might also notice the scent of linseed. Dye preparation often uses it." Grayson gave a dismissive laugh. "My dear lady, you've quite the imagination." "Oh, not imagination, Inspector," she said sweetly. "Observation." He muttered something about interference and left, soon after, boots echoing down the lane. Mrs. Whitby looked worried. "You shouldn't tease him, Jane." "I wouldn't dream of it," Miss Marple said. "But I do think someone in this village has been playing chemist with their conscience." That night, long after Mrs. Whitby and Lydia had gone to bed, Miss Marple remained by the parlour window, her knitting folded neatly beside her. The fog had thickened again, pressing close to the glass. Across the green, faint points of light flickered where the lanterns still hung, golden, wavering like the souls of the cautious. All but one. At the far end of the hollow road, one post stood empty. The hook swayed gently in the mist, bare. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "If a red lantern burns for death," she murmured, "what might an unlit one mean?" The clock chimed midnight. The fog rolled past the window, soft as breath, swallowing the last gleam of light. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. The fog that morning lay thinner over Blackmere, but the village was no less subdued. It had the air of a place holding its breath. Curtains stayed half-drawn, footsteps echoed quickly along the cobbled lane, and even the church bells sounded reluctant to ring. Only the crows seemed unbothered, dark flecks wheeling lazily above the marsh, their cries echoing through the grey. Miss Marple stood at Mrs. Whitby's window, her hands resting lightly on the sill. The world outside looked washed of colour, the kind of pale quiet that follows shock. Behind her, Mrs. Whitby fussed with a tea tray, the china rattling faintly. "Vicar gave a dreadful sermon this morning," she said. "All about light and sin and the wages of secrecy, as though poor Mr. Pike had earned divine punishment." Ministers often confuse the moral with the mystical, said Miss Marple mildly. It helps when the truth feels untidy. She turned, adjusting her shawl. I think, my dear, I should visit Mrs. Rowley again. People tend to remember more clearly once their audience grows smaller. Mrs. Whitby looked alarmed. Oh, Jane, you can't mean to go alone? Alone, yes, but not unwelcome, she smiled. Curiosity is a fine escort. Agnes Rowley's cottage stood near the churchyard wall, its small windows fogged from within. When Miss Marple knocked, a pause lingered before the latch lifted. The widow appeared, shawl pulled tight, eyes darting nervously. Oh, it's you again. I've said all I know, miss. Terrible business. Terrible. Miss Marple inclined her head. I quite agree, and I should not trouble you again, except that memory can be such a generous creature when spoken to kindly. She was invited in reluctantly. The room smelled of damp stone and stale coal smoke. On the table stood a candle, burning low and steady. The same red-tinged wax Miss Marple had begun to recognize. Agnes sank into her chair. I told the inspector. I saw Mr. Pike. Saw him going down the hollow with someone following. It was dark, but I saw. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. How fortunate you were facing that way. You must have good eyesight in fog. Agnes frowned, twisting her fingers in her lap. Well, I heard them first. Voices. Arguing. Voices? Miss Marple repeated softly. Was it two men or a man and a woman? The widow's eyes flickered. Couldn't say for certain. Sound carries strange at night. Yes, Miss Marple said, and sometimes it carries guilt. For a moment, the only sound was the slow tick of the mantel clock. Then Agnes leaned forward, whispering as though the fog itself might be listening. There's things best left where the marsh put 'em, miss. Some folks don't like the dead disturbed. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, Mrs. Rowley, it wasn't the marsh that killed Mr. Pike. It was something far less romantic. The widow's face tightened. You think you're clever? But clever folk get lost out there too. Marple smiled faintly. Then I shall keep to the path. She rose, thanking her for the tea she had not touched, and left. But not before her eyes lingered on a curious thing, a pair of muddy boots by the door, smaller than the widow's feet should require. The soles bore dried wax. The hollow road lay empty as Miss Marple walked home, the mist thinning into ribbons that curled across the ditches. Halfway along, she noticed a glint among the hedgerow brambles. Bending, she found a glove, caked in mud, soft leather, too small for a man's hand. One side bore a faint red smudge near the thumb. She wrapped it in her handkerchief, examining it under the light of her parasol lantern. The shape and make were finer than the workman's sort. It could never have belonged to Thomas Pike. Well now, she murmured, what a curious way for a lady to misplace her decency. The glove went carefully into her pocket. When she returned to Mrs. Whitby's parlour, the fire was burning low, and Lydia had just finished setting a tray of sandwiches. At the table sat Evelyn March, the young schoolteacher, looking pale but composed. Her fingers rested around a teacup, though her eyes were elsewhere. Miss March came to pay her respects, said Mrs. Whitby. Such a shock for the children. Poor Mr. Pike having died so near their playground. Yes, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves with careful precision. Children do dislike disruption to routine. It makes their elders seem unreliable. Evelyn smiled faintly. I suppose it does. I came to assure them it wasn't a ghost. They'll sleep easier that way. How kind, said Miss Marple. And what do you tell yourself to sleep, my dear? Evelyn blinked, startled by the softness of the question. Her thumb brushed the rim of the cup, where a speck of red wax clung near her nail. Only that some things are best forgotten, she said quietly. Pike wasn't liked. He made people pay for their mistakes. Collectors often do, Miss Marple replied. Did he ever call upon you? The teacher hesitated, colour rising in her cheeks. He handled a debt my father owed before he died. I thought it was settled. He didn't. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the pop of the fire. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face, the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand. She saw something beyond fear. Resentment. Evelyn stood abruptly. Forgive me, Mrs. Whitby, I've lessons to prepare. Her farewell was polite, but her departure too swift. From the window, Miss Marple watched her cross the green, coat flaring against the wind like a dark wing. That evening, while Mrs. Whitby sorted through her late husband's old papers, Miss Marple helped stack envelopes and bills into tidy piles. One yellowed envelope slipped behind the mantel clock. When Miss Marple reached for it, Mrs. Whitby stiffened. Oh, that's nothing, she said too quickly. Just old business. Better left alone. Miss Marple's eyes, mild as candlelight, read the faded handwriting. To Mr. Thomas Pike, it said. My dear, she said softly, you never posted this? Mrs. Whitby wrung her hands. My husband wrote it before he died. It was about the marsh rights. Pike handled the deeds, and there was something unfair. I found the letter after the funeral, but sending it seemed useless. And now it seems dangerous, Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Whitby nodded miserably. He threatened me once. Said if I didn't keep quiet, he'd see our cottage taken. I never told anyone. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on hers. Hush now. Fear is often louder than guilt, and twice as persistent. Let us not give it company. It was nearly 10 when Lydia crept into the parlour, her face pale as flour. Miss Marple, she whispered, I found this outside by the doorstep. She held out a stub of red candle, its wax soft from the cold, its wick blackened to a curl. Miss Marple took it, turning it beneath the lamp. The wax felt slick. Paraffin, dyed crimson, melted evenly, poured with precision, not store-bought, but crafted. How odd, she said, half to herself. A candle made not for prayer, but for performance. Mrs. Whitby crossed herself. You think it's another warning? I think, said Miss Marple, someone has mistaken folklore for a curtain behind which to murder. She set the candle stub on the mantel beside the rescued glove. 2 clues, modest and silent, but together they whispered of intention. That night, as the fog crept once more across the fields, Miss Marple sat by the dimming fire, notebook open before her. She wrote only 4 lines, red wax, poured, not dripped. Glove, too small for a man. Widow's boots, waxed soles. Letter, motive unspoken. Then she underlined the final note. Fear disguises purpose. Outside, the lanterns swayed faintly in the breeze, golden eyes peering through the mist. One, near the hollow's edge, flickered and died. Miss Marple closed her notebook, eyes narrowing. When the lantern burns red, one soul must be led, she whispered. But who, I wonder, decided who that soul would be? The fog thickened, swallowing the lights one by one. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Fog. The mist returned that morning like an old guest who had forgotten its manners. It clung low to the hedgerows, curling round chimneys, and soaking the cobblestones until every footprint filled with silver water. From the parlour window, Miss Marple watched the village stir uneasily to life. People moved briskly, eyes lowered, their greetings curt and clipped. Blackmere, once cheerful with gossip, had grown wary of its own voice. Down by the green, the blacksmith's forge exhaled thin threads of smoke. The rhythmic clank of hammer against iron rang faintly through the air. but there was no song to accompany it. Even the bellows sighed reluctantly. Mrs. Whitby entered with her shawl drawn close. "The village feels colder somehow," she murmured. "Samuel Holt hasn't been to church, Agnes Rowley hasn't left her cottage, and poor Evelyn looked pale as paper at the school gates." "Guilt often chills the blood," Miss Marple said softly. She folded her knitting, rose, and reached for her coat. "I believe I should take a little walk before the fog makes a habit of staying." The blacksmith's forge smelled of smoke, soot, and regret. Sparks flared like fireflies as Samuel Holt struck at a horseshoe, his shoulders glistening with sweat despite the cold. When he noticed Miss Marple standing at the doorway, he lowered his hammer, wiped his brow, and forced a smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to have the poker mended, have you?" "Indeed," she said cheerfully, holding out the small iron hook from Mrs. Whitby's fireplace, though I dare say it suffered less from use than from neglect. He chuckled uneasily, took it from her hand, and placed it on the anvil. The hammer came down once, too sharply. His movements were heavy, his gaze elsewhere. "I imagine business must have been lively with the festival preparations," Miss Marple remarked. "So many lanterns to hang, so many hooks to fit." "Aye," he said, his tone tight. "The children's lanterns mostly. Miss March had me make the brackets. Pretty things, them pumpkins." "Indeed," she said. "And she asked for coloured wax, I believe?" The hammer stopped mid-swing. "She might have. School projects and all. Said she'd pay after the festival." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "And did she?" "No," he muttered. "But it's of no matter." The smell of linseed oil hung faintly in the air, sweet and metallic. On the workbench near the bellows lay several tins, one marked red dye, another held candle moulds, their rims stained pink. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over them without expression. "How curious," she murmured, "that the festival colours should linger so long after the lanterns are cold." Holt turned sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing at all, Mr. Holt," she said kindly. "Only that wax remembers warmth better than men do." By midday, Miss Marple stood in the late Mr. Pike's cottage. Inspector Grayson accompanied her, his overcoat dripping from the mist. He had finally, though reluctantly, agreed that a second look might be educational. The sitting room smelled of damp tobacco and ledgers. Papers lay stacked on the desk, each column of numbers precise and unforgiving. Miss Marple leafed through them delicately, her fingertips barely grazing the edges. "There," she said, pointing to a blot of crimson wax sealing one corner. "That's not the usual colour for correspondence." Grayson frowned. "Lantern wax again?" "Paraffin with dye," she replied. "The sort used for marking pages." She found the entry. "Rowley, rent due 27 octri. Beneath it, 2 initials. E.M. "Evelyn March," she said quietly. He kept notes on them both. Grayson sighed. Everyone owed Pike something. The man was a vulture. "And sometimes," said Miss Marple, "vultures are useful, until they remind their feeders what they've swallowed." She turned another page. A torn edge appeared near the centre of the ledger, a full sheet missing. The cut was clean, deliberate. She lifted it to the light. Faint smudges of wax marked the tear, the same deep red hue. "Someone removed evidence under candlelight," she murmured. "A tidy worker, but impatient." The inspector rubbed his chin. "You believe the murderer tore this out?" "Or someone protecting the murderer," she said. He exhaled sharply. "It's always protection or guilt with you, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said, eyes twinkling faintly. "One generally leads to the other." By afternoon, the fog thickened again, turning the road to a ribbon of pale grey silk. Miss Marple stopped once more at Agnes Rowley's cottage. A lamp burned in the window, though it was barely 3 o'clock. Agnes opened the door, only a crack. "You again! Can't a woman grieve in peace?" I wasn't aware you and Mr. Pike were close enough for grief, Miss Marple said pleasantly. But since you mention it, perhaps you'd rather discuss money? The door opened fully. Money? I owe no one. Miss Marple's smile remained gentle. Then you needn't fear his ledger. Agnes's face drained of colour. She backed a step. He came for rent, that's all. Said I could pay in other ways if I liked. I told him to rot in his own sin. Her voice cracked. I left the candle lit at the window so he'd see my door if he changed his mind, but when I looked again, it burned red. I swear it. The lantern man's warning. Miss Marple's tone softened. And it frightened you so thoroughly you told everyone you saw two figures, though you saw only yourself reflected in the window. Agnes's lips trembled. You don't understand. Oh, I do, Miss Marple said gently. You helped him meet someone, Mrs. Rowley. Perhaps thinking it harmless. But you weren't the only watcher that night. Agnes's eyes filled with tears. I didn't kill him. I never said you did, Miss Marple murmured. But silence, my dear, often works harder than any weapon. By evening, Miss Marple followed the faint scent of oil along the marsh path behind the smithy. The mist swirled low, luminous under the setting sun. The ground squelched beneath her shoes. Head, half hidden by reeds, stood a small wooden shack. Its door hung askew, one hinge rusted. Inside she found remnants of wax, tin moulds, and a shallow metal basin with red residue crusted along its rim. A single lantern hung from a hook, its glass tinted faintly pink from dye. Nearby lay a stained rag, stiff with oil. She ran a gloved finger along the basin's edge. Clever, she murmured. Ingenious even, a manufactured omen. And an obedient audience. A rustle outside made her glance toward the doorway, but it was only a heron lifting off from the reeds. The sound of its wings blended with the sighing wind, leaving her alone again with her thoughts. She stepped out, closing the door carefully behind her. By the time she returned to Mrs. Whitby's parlour, the fog had reclaimed the village. The lamps glowed dull gold through the mist, and the cobbles shone like black glass. Miss Marple removed her hat, shook off the damp, and sat near the fire. Mrs. Whitby looked up anxiously. You've been gone for hours. You shouldn't wander the marsh this late. Oh, my dear, I wasn't wandering. I was following a smell so rather more reliable than gossip. Mrs. Whitby poured tea with trembling hands. You've found something, haven't you? Yes, Miss Marple said, stirring her cup. I've found that ghosts require planning, and our lantern man had quite the architect. Mrs. Whitby frowned. You mean the lantern was fake? Oh, very real in light, she said, but false in meaning. The red lantern was never a warning. It was a signal, a device to make honest people afraid of the road until morning. Long enough for footprints to fade and guilt to settle. Mrs. Whitby's lips parted. Then who? Miss Marple's voice lowered. Someone clever, practical and desperate. Someone who knows both the art of mixing wax and the price of debt. Evelyn March, whispered Mrs. Whitby. Miss Marple didn't answer. She only looked into the fire where the flames curled red as candlelight. That night, as fog thickened once more over the marsh, a faint glow appeared near the churchyard. From Mrs. Whitby's window, Miss Marple saw it, a single lantern burning crimson. Another omen, murmured Mrs. Whitby, clutching her shawl. Not an omen, said Miss Marple quietly. An invitation. The red light flickered, reflected in her eyes like a secret already half solved. It was not the marsh that breathed beneath the fog, she thought. It was guilt, testing how long it could stay unseen. Chapter 5. The Unlit Lantern. The fog had thinned, but unease still lingered like an aftertaste. By morning, the villagers of Blackmere moved through the square with uneasy eyes. The smith, the teacher, the widow, Each pretended to busy themselves, but all their movements were too sharp, too deliberate, as if the air itself demanded secrecy. Miss Marple watched from the bench near the bakery, her knitting resting loosely in her lap. Around her, life continued its nervous pantomime. Someone dropped a basket of apples, a boy ran through the mist shouting something about omens, and old Mrs. Pritchard muttered that another red light had been seen at dawn. The inspector called it marsh gas, but no one believed him. Fear had taken root too deeply to be pulled up by reason. "Strange, isn't it?" Mrs. Whitby said beside her. "How people seem smaller when they're frightened." "Not smaller, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "Simply reduced to their truest size." She looked up toward the hollow road, where the lantern posts stood crookedly like a row of headstones. "Fear," she murmured, "is a most revealing candle." By dusk, Miss Marple had decided the time had come to test that candle. She called upon Inspector Grayson at the constable's office, where he was polishing his spectacles with an air of professional irritation. "If I might offer a suggestion," she said politely, "perhaps we should relight the lanterns along the hollow. It would comfort the villagers. Fear thrives best in the dark." He raised an eyebrow. "And what do you expect to find by hanging pumpkins, Miss Marple?" "Not what I expect to find, Inspector. But whom?" Within the hour, the men of the village gathered reluctantly to rehang and relight the lanterns. The fog rolled low over the marsh, the candles flickered uncertainly in the damp. Miss Marple, walking behind the line of lights, ensured that one hook, the fifth from the churchyard, the place where Thomas Pike had been found, was left unlit. A simple omission, unremarkable to most eyes. But she was watching for the person who would notice. The hollow road looked almost beautiful that night, gold lights shimmering through the mist, their reflections quivering on the wet cobblestones. The villagers moved slowly, speaking in low tones. The red lantern's legend hung heavy on every breath. Miss Marple stood at the bend near the smithy, her eyes calm beneath the brim of her hat. She watched as Evelyn March passed with a group of schoolchildren, their hands linked like small shadows. When they reached the unlit post, Evelyn stopped. Her hand rose slightly, as though reaching for something that wasn't there. "It should be burning," she whispered. "It always burns." One of the children tugged her sleeve. "Miss March?" She blinked, straightened, and hurried them along. But Miss Marple caught the tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted toward the marsh as though afraid of memory, not myth. The villagers noticed too. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that the lantern man was offended, but Miss Marple, hidden in the half-light, only smiled faintly. The experiment had worked. Later that night, a roar of flame burst from the smithy. Holt worked furiously at the forge, hammering metal with feverish rhythm, sweat shining on his brow. Miss Marple appeared in the doorway, her presence quiet, yet unmistakable. "You'll ruin that anvil, Mr. Holt," she said mildly. He turned, startled. "You should be home, ma'am. Ain't safe out." "Nor is the forge," she observed, eyeing the glowing coals. "It seems a poor time to feed the fire." He scowled, hammer slamming down again. "I'll not have them blame me. I've made my share of mistakes, but I never meant—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. "Meant what?" she asked gently. He looked away. "Nothing, just some lights should never go out, that's all." Her eyes flickered toward the workbench, newly scrubbed, spotless, too clean. The tins of dye and the candle moulds were gone. "Indeed," she said softly, "though tidiness, I've found, often follows guilt." He glared. "You'll not find anything here." "Oh no," she said, smiling kindly. "Not here, Mr. Holt, but I shall find what you gave away." The next morning, fog clung low over the fields, and the school bell rang faintly through the still air. Miss Marple visited the schoolhouse with a basket of scones, a visit presented as neighbourly courtesy. Evelyn March sat at her desk, marking papers. Her eyes looked hollowed by sleeplessness, her voice courteous but brittle. "You look tired, Miss March," Miss Marple said. "I do hope the red lanterns aren't keeping you awake." "They're keeping everyone awake," Evelyn replied, forcing a laugh. "Children dream of ghosts now. It's absurd." "Absurd things often conceal practical ones," Miss Marple said, setting the basket down. "Like a candle that changes its colour, for instance." Evelyn's hand froze over the ink pot. "Or a glove," Miss Marple continued softly. "Found in a hedge, too small for a man, with a trace of red wax inside." Evelyn's eyes flickered. "You've quite the imagination, Miss Marple." "I assure you, my dear, it's not imagination, only deduction. You see, that glove was worn by someone who handled a red candle, a homemade one made with linseed oil and paraffin dye. It's clever work, very precise, almost teacherly." Evelyn's voice came sharp. "You think I was at home correcting essays?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course, it must be so tiresome when the essays talk back." For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. Then she stood, gathering her books. "If you'll excuse me, I've lessons to prepare." "Certainly," said Miss Marple. "But before you go, you once asked Mr. Holt for coloured wax, didn't you?" Evelyn turned sharply, the colour draining from her face. "For the children's lanterns." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "For the children." That evening, Miss Marple laid out her notes by candlelight. Beside her teacup lay the unlit lantern hook she had borrowed from the hollow. Its iron glinted faintly red where rust met wax. The pattern was obvious now, elegant in its cruelty. The red lantern had been a signal, not from the dead, but from the living. The unlit one had been its twin. She imagined it, Evelyn March arranging with Holt to prepare the lanterns. She tells him, innocently enough, "Leave the one by the marsh dark. It's bad luck to light them all." He obeys. Later that night, Evelyn meets Pike there, under the only post without light. A quarrel, harsh words, her father's debts, his threats, a struggle. And then silence. The next morning she hides the wax, dyes the candle red, and hangs it anew, letting superstition smother logic. Miss Marple closed her notebook. "How clever," she murmured, "to use fear as a curtain." Before dawn, she placed an unlit lantern on the step of Evelyn's cottage. By breakfast it was gone. When Inspector Grayson arrived, she told him nothing of the experiment, only that it might be useful to check the schoolhouse. Behind the desk they found a small tin marked scarlet pigment, paraffin blend. Grayson's eyes widened. "Well, she kept it right here." Miss Marple shook her head. "People who act from panic seldom hide things well. It isn't a criminal's cunning we're dealing with, Inspector, only a frightened conscience." He frowned. "You're certain it's her?" "Certainty," she said, "is a dangerous luxury." But she flinched when darkness failed to perform for her. I call that a confession of sorts. That night, the fog returned, thicker than ever. Miss Marple stood at her window, shawl drawn close, eyes fixed on the hollow road below. All the lanterns glowed golden, save for one near the churchyard, which remained dark. From the marsh came the faint sound of footsteps and then a sob. A woman's voice, breaking under weight too heavy to bear. Miss Marple whispered, "Superstition always ends where guilt begins." She reached forward, snuffed out her candle, and let the darkness claim the room. Some truths, she thought, shine best without light. The fog rolled through Blackmere once more, swallowing the lanterns whole. Chapter 6. The Marsh Confession. The fog returned heavier than before, a white silence that turned Blackmere into a ghost of itself. Lanterns still glowed along the hollow, but their light seemed swallowed mid-air, pale halos trembling in the mist. People had stopped talking about who might be guilty. They spoke now of what might come next. Fear had become a living thing. Inspector Grayson stood in Mrs. Whitby's parlour, hat in hand, irritation sharp in his eyes. "I've had enough of this village theatre," he said. "We've got the tin of red dye, the glove, and half a dozen witnesses who saw Miss March near the hollow. It's time we acted." Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried grace. "Yes, Inspector, but sometimes an arrest only frightens truth into silence. You'd let her go?" "I'd let her speak," she said softly. "And she will, if you let me go to her first." Grayson frowned. "At night? Out there?" "Truth, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, setting down the teapot. "Has very particular hours." The marsh was a breathing thing that night, sighing, shifting, whispering through reeds. Miss Marple moved carefully along the path, her lantern cupped in one gloved hand, the fog curling round her like wet silk. Beneath her shoes, the earth was soft and treacherous. Ahead loomed the old shed, its door crooked, its window a cracked square of blackness. She stepped inside and set the lantern on the workbench. The small flame wavered, casting light over moulds, tins, and the ghostly shimmer of spilled dye. A faint rustle came from the doorway. "Good evening, Miss March," Miss Marple said without turning. Evelyn stood there, her coat drawn tightly round her shoulders, her face pale and hollow in the half-light. "How did you know I'd come?" "I left you a note," Miss Marple said gently. It seemed polite to invite confession properly. Evelyn's breath shivered in the cold air. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that you've been trying not to remember how." For a long while, Evelyn said nothing. Only the fog moved, seeping under the door, dimming the edges of the room until the lantern's glow became a small island of warmth. Miss Marple did not press her. Silence, she knew, could loosen tongues better than accusation. Finally, Evelyn whispered, "He wasn't supposed to die." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Few ever are. He came that night, called me names, said my father cheated him, said he'd tell the board at the school. I begged him to wait." Her voice cracked. He laughed, said I was no better than my father. I tried to go past him, and he caught my wrist. I struck him with the post, and I only meant to get free. She sank onto the low stool near the bench, trembling. "When I saw him fall, I thought he'd stand up again, but he didn't, and the marsh was so quiet, like it had swallowed the sound." Miss Marple watched her calmly, eyes tender, hands folded on her cane. "And then?" Evelyn looked up, tears shining faintly. "Then I remembered what Agnes said, about the lantern man taking the wicked. So I made the lantern red. I thought—" She gave a small, broken laugh. "I thought if they feared the curse, no one would come near him till morning." And no one did. For a long while, Evelyn said nothing. Only the fog moved, seeping under the door, dimming the edges of the room until the lantern's glow became a small island of warmth. Miss Marple did not press her. Silence, she knew, could loosen tongues better than accusation. Finally, Evelyn whispered, "He wasn't supposed to die." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Few ever are. He came that night, called me names, said my father cheated him, said he'd tell the board at the school. I begged him to wait." Her voice cracked. He laughed, said I was no better than my father. I tried to go past him, and he caught my wrist. I struck him with the post, and I only meant to get free. She sank onto the low stool near the bench, trembling. "When I saw him fall, I thought he'd stand up again, but he didn't, and the marsh was so quiet, like it had swallowed the sound. Miss Marple watched her calmly, eyes tender, hands folded on her cane. And then Evelyn looked up, tears shining faintly. Then I remembered what Agnes said, about the lantern man taking the wicked. So I made the lantern red. I thought... She gave a small, broken laugh. I thought if they feared the curse, no one would come near him till morning. And no one did. The crunch of boots on gravel broke the quiet. Grayson appeared in the doorway, lantern raised. His face, framed by the fog, seemed carved from worry and disbelief. "Well," he said, lowering the light, "seems you were right again." Evelyn flinched. "You'll take me away?" "Eventually," Miss Marple said, "but not as a criminal inspector, as a woman who has been lost too long in her own fog." Grayson frowned. "You think the magistrate will see it that way?" "They seldom see clearly," Miss Marple replied. "But light travels even through mist. Sometimes slower, that's all." Evelyn bowed her head. "Will they hang me?" Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. "No, my dear, you've been hanging yourself every night since that one. It's quite enough." Quite. By dawn, the fog began to lift. The marsh glistened like dull silver, water rippling where the reeds moved. The villagers, pale and curious, stood along the lane as the constable led Evelyn away. No one spoke. The legend had died without ceremony. Mrs. Whitby found Miss Marple by the window, watching the mist dissolve. "They're taking her," she whispered. "She looked almost peaceful." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "Confession often feels like forgiveness long before the law understands it." Mrs. Whitby sighed. "And the lantern man?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He'll not trouble anyone again. He was never in the marsh, you see. He lived here." She touched her temple. "And here." She laid a hand over her heart. "He was fear, dressed in a story." They watched as the villagers began to take down the lanterns one by one. The last to fall was the red one, its colour dulled by daylight. The wick smoked, then died. "Fear built the legend," Miss Marple said quietly. "Reason ended it." And as the sun climbed higher, turning the fog to threads of light, the marsh lay still, empty, forgiven, and finally silent. Chapter 7. The Light That Stayed. 2 days had passed since Evelyn March's confession, and the fog had finally lifted from Blackmere. The marsh gleamed under a pale morning sun, a silver mirror, too bright for remembering. The villagers walked more freely now, their voices lighter, their laughter unsure but returning. Still, Blackmere was not healed. It had the uneasy quiet of a church after a funeral. Air cleared, but not yet clean. Miss Marple walked along the lane toward the churchyard, her cane tapping softly on the stones. The world looked washed, the sky a dull blue, the trees dripping with dew. She paused where the hollow road began, where the last of the lanterns still swayed gently in the breeze. Each one had been cleaned and rehung for the vicar's Thanksgiving service. Fear, it seemed, had found a pious disguise. Mrs. Whitby joined her, breath visible in the cool air. "They say it's all over now," she said, "that the curse is lifted." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Curses, my dear, end only when people tire of them, but truth lingers far longer." They walked together past the iron gate, pausing where the grass turned to mud. The marsh stretched wide and still, pale as milk under the sun. From the distance came the faint toll of the church bell, slow, deliberate, as if marking not repentance, but release. By noon, Inspector Grayson called upon Miss Marple at Mrs. Whitby's house. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "Miss March has given her full statement," he said. "Said it was an accident. The Crown will likely spare her the rope." I'm relieved, Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup. Gallows never teach as much as guilt does. Grayson hesitated, lowering his voice. But there's more. She mentioned a woman who knew, threatened to tell unless she was kept quiet. Called herself a friend. Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply. A friend, she repeated softly. Or a parasite, perhaps. She rose, took her shawl, and said simply, I believe I'll call upon Mrs. Rowley. Agnes Rowley's cottage looked different now. The windows were newly washed, the curtains mended, and a faint scent of soap replaced the usual damp. The widow herself answered the door briskly, cheeks flushed, eyes cautious. Ah, Miss Marple, come to check on a poor woman after all this horror. I came to admire your industry, Miss Marple said pleasantly. The place looks prosperous. Agnes smiled thinly. One makes do. Times improve once wickedness is gone from a village. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the silver brooch pinned to her shawl, engraved E.M. in delicate cursive. A fine piece, she remarked. A gift? Agnes hesitated, fingers brushing it protectively. Oh, this. Found it by the road after they took Miss March away. Thought I'd keep it safe. How thoughtful, Miss Marple said mildly. She'll no doubt be touched by your concern. A silence settled, broken only by the slow tick of the mantel clock. Agnes busied herself with the teapot, pouring tea with nervous precision. I heard you were helping the inspector, Agnes said finally. Not much left to help now, I suppose. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, some matters remain, small, perhaps, but stubborn. For instance, the letters in Miss March's satchel, notes written in a tidy hand, signed A.R. Curious, don't you think? Agnes froze. Letters? Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle, the softness of silk hiding the sharpness beneath. Threatening to tell unless the favour continued. Blackmail, Mrs. Rowley, however you wrap it. I dare say Miss March paid you well to keep her secret. Agnes's face went white. I only wanted what was fair, she whispered. She's educated, had her salary, her comforts. And me? Alone all these years, living on scraps. Miss Marple set her teacup down quietly. There is no fairness in fear, my dear. You did not invent the ghost, but you fed it until it learned to eat the living. Agnes gripped the edge of the table. I never thought she'd end herself like that. Few ever think far enough, Miss Marple said. That is how evil works best, through small bargains and lazy mercy. Agnes looked down, tears mixing with shame. Miss Marple rose, collected her gloves, and said softly, You should pray for her peace, Mrs. Rowley, and perhaps for your own. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Grayson in Mrs. Whitby's parlour, firelight flickering across their faces. He listened silently as she recounted her visit to the widow. She as good as admitted it, he muttered. But letters aren't enough for a charge. No, said Miss Marple, but the law doesn't own every truth. Sometimes exposure is enough. He leaned back with a sigh. You're saying I should let her walk free? Free, yes, but seen, she replied. That's punishment enough for those who thrive in shadows. He studied her thoughtfully. You know, I never quite understood how fear could be currency, till now. Pike traded it. Evelyn bought with it. Rowley lived off it. Whole village dealt in it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, Inspector, fear is the oldest form of wealth. Only reason ever makes us poor again. He chuckled, shaking his head. You make the strangest sort of detective. Because I prefer to catch people, she said softly, before the law does. 2 evenings later, the vicar organized a small gathering to remove the remaining lanterns from the hollow road. The villagers came dressed in their Sunday coats, faces solemn but curious. The children carried baskets for the candles. The women murmured prayers, half out of faith, half out of habit. When the last lantern, the red one, was brought down, Mrs. Whitby turned to Miss Marple. "You should keep it, Jane. After all, you ended its legend." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I only turned the light the right way up, my dear." The vicar said a brief prayer, thanking Providence for light restored to Blackmere. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noted how easily people rewrite miracles once the danger is gone. Humans, she thought, are the finest candle makers in the world, forever shaping light to whatever shape comforts them most. Later that night, she placed the now clear lantern on Mrs. Whitby's windowsill. The flame inside burned steady and pale, its glow reflecting across the quiet road toward the marsh. No fog, no red glimmer, only peace. She sat back in her chair, knitting resting idle in her lap, and looked at the flame. "There are two kinds of darkness," she murmured to herself. "The kind that hides and the kind that heals." The marsh, seen through the window, shimmered faintly under the moonlight, no longer sinister, just part of the land again. And the lantern's glow held steady, a golden thread tying the quiet house to the cleansed night beyond. Blackmere slept. Fear was gone. Only the light remained, the light that stayed. Chapter 8. The Silence of the Marsh. Morning came with a washed light, that rare kind of English dawn where everything seems touched by forgiveness. The fog had lifted entirely, leaving the sky pale and rinsed, the marsh glimmering like new glass. The air smelt of rain and wood smoke and clean earth. Blackmere, for the first time in weeks, had no ghosts left to fear. Miss Marple stood by the window of Mrs. Whitby's parlour, watching thin sunlight fall over the lane. Outside, two children chased a hoop across the cobbles, their laughter sharp and pure in the chill air. From the smithy came the slow, steady sound of hammering, not angry now, but rhythmic, almost cheerful. Even the crows sounded less ominous, as though they too had decided to forgive the place. Mrs. Whitby fussed behind her, folding shawls into Miss Marple's small travel case. "I can't bear to think you're leaving," she said. "You brought light back to this dreadful village, Jane." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I did nothing the sun wouldn't have done given time. Darkness, my dear, grows terribly bored when no one tends to it." Mrs. Whitby sniffed. "The vicar says it was a test from God." "Vicars," said Miss Marple, fastening her gloves, "always think he has a fondness for examinations." They shared a soft laugh. Then Miss Marple lifted her small case and paused by the door, glancing once more toward the window where the last lantern, now scrubbed clear, still sat on the sill. "Keep it burning a little while," she said. "Not as a warning, but as a reminder. Fear should never be allowed to think it can return without invitation." Mrs. Whitby nodded, eyes shining. "I'll keep it bright, Jane." Blackmere looked different under sunlight. The same cottages, the same crooked roofs, yet everything seemed reborn under the pale glow of morning. Curtains were open, windows unlatched, and even Agnes Rowley's garden showed signs of care. As Miss Marple walked past, the widow stood at her door, face drawn and thin. Their eyes met. Agnes looked away first. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Good day, Mrs. Rowley." A small nod came in return, not apology, not gratitude, merely acknowledgement. But it was enough. Miss Marple continued down the lane, her cane tapping lightly against the stones. She passed the bakery where the smell of warm bread drifted out onto the street. The baker's wife called out, "Leaving us already, Miss Marple?" "Villages, my dear, are rather like puddings," she answered cheerfully. best enjoyed while warm, but one mustn't stay till they harden. Laughter followed her down the road. Inspector Grayson waited near the small wooden platform, hat in hand. The train's whistle sounded faintly in the distance, a long, thin note over the fields. "I thought I'd see you off," he said awkwardly. "It's not often we get detectives with patients instead of handcuffs." Miss Marple smiled. "Patience saves paper, Inspector. Fewer reports." He chuckled, then sobered. "I keep thinking about it all. How easily fear took hold. Pike made people afraid of poverty. Evelyn was afraid of exposure. Rowley afraid of hunger. All of it came down to fear." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "fear is so rarely the villain. It's what people build from it that becomes monstrous." He nodded slowly. "Evelyn March, she's calmer now, says she feels lighter." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Confession, you see, is not the end of punishment. It's the beginning of peace." Grayson looked down, thumb brushing the brim of his hat. "I'll miss your way of seeing things." "I dare say," she said, eyes twinkling. "You'll learn to borrow it when next the fog comes." The train whistle sounded again, nearer now. She gave him her hand, firm and warm. "You've been very kind, Inspector." He tipped his hat. "You've been instructive, Miss Marple." She smiled. "We'll call that even." Before boarding, Miss Marple turned toward the marsh one final time. It lay beyond the trees, a sweep of pale green and silver water, quiet and endless. The lantern posts stood empty now, their hooks bare against the horizon. The wind stirred gently, rippling through the reeds. On the water's surface drifted a single red petal, vivid against the grey, spinning lazily before the current carried it beneath the surface. She watched it go, eyes soft. "Even guilt," she whispered, "sinks gently when forgiveness is allowed to breathe." A bird rose suddenly from the reeds, its wings catching the light like glass. The sound of it, quick, bright, broke the long stillness that had haunted Blackmere for weeks. She smiled. "There you are," she murmured. A hymn instead of a lament. The engine rolled into the platform, hissing softly. Miss Marple stepped aboard, took her seat by the window, and settled her shawl around her shoulders. The village slipped slowly from view, cottages shrinking, marsh receding, sunlight glancing off wet fields. She took out her small notebook, turned to the last blank page, and wrote, "Superstition hides truth. Fear feeds it. Kindness ends it." She underlined the last words, then closed the book. Outside, the marsh shimmered one final time before the bend swallowed it. No fog, no lanterns, only stillness. The pure, forgiving kind that comes after truth has spoken. Miss Marple leaned back, hands folded neatly in her lap, and smiled faintly. Somewhere behind her, in a quiet cottage window, one lantern still burned, not red, not fearful, but golden, the light that stayed.